All right, calling the meeting to order here.
Okay, look at that, very presidential.
With the president's approval here, yes. As usual, we'll start with our round of introductions. I'm Wayne Ives, the In-Stream Flow Specialist from New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services, and I want to introduce Dave Simon to you. He's a UNH Master's student, and he's here to present some of the work that he's been doing in the watershed tonight, and that'll be part of later on. So anything you want to add to that? Or
No, I think that was fine.
okay.
And I've always wanted to believe in Simon Says. Does anyone remember that? I actually know in Hebrew, Shimon Mea, which means Simon Says in Hebrew.
Oh,
Anyway,
thank
you're
you.
welcome.
That's Steve.
I'm Steve Soroff, one of the co-weed watchers. Weed watchers. Yeah, whatever we are.
I'm Tracy Sills, Rivers and Lakes Programs Manager at DES.
Ted Deers, I'm the Administrator of the Watershed Management Bureau at DES.
John Decker, President of Tuckaway Lake Association.
Dennis Lucia, Board Member of PLIA.
Pam Kelly, I'm the Secretary of the Tuckaway Lake Improvement Association.
Neil Sanders, underwater resident of Lake Tuckaway.
Milfoil Patrol.
Milfoil team leader.
I'm Susan Hayes, I'm on PLIA board also.
Jim Green, PLIA Board. Dave Whitney, Interested Citizen.
All right, so I've got a presentation as usual and kind of update things. Well, it's a standard boilerplate of what we do here. We review reports and information and have meetings that are open to the public semi-annually. Tonight's agenda, I wanted to talk about a little bit about the milfoil, just because it's one of the ongoing issues and the status of the in-stream flow rules as we move forward out of the pilot program and the conditions on the rivers and the lakes over this last summer, and the phosphorus study, which is actually more of a phosphorus and nitrogen study that Dave's going to talk about, and then anything else we want to bring up. Neil's actually probably more expert and more detailed than I am about this, but I did talk to the guys that are pulling the weeds, and they've said that they seem to be making good progress because they're finding that they're not getting clumps of milfoil any longer. They're just single strands. They're not getting very long, so they have less of a chance to break off or less of a chance to have wave action or boats cut them off and spread them. And they've been staying right in this area, so they're real pleased. And you guys have been keeping them on target with finding them and getting them out there when it's necessary, especially before big weekends. So it's important to make sure when the boats traffic is going to be heavy that these things are taken care of. So last I knew that they were out there just before Labor Day, I think, and pulled out anywhere between 9 and 12, I think it was, but
11 spots.
yeah. So they're feeling real confident that it's just a matter of beating it down for a few more years, and maybe we'll get past this. But it's not one of those things that happens overnight. It's just a continuous maintenance and hard work at just making sure that reconnaissance and removal. So.
Good idea.
Is it, anybody need?
Sign it up.
You said let there be darkness
Is that better?
Yeah.
Yeah, this way, better that way.
Wow.
Too much?
Ted will be asleep in a minute. It's a nice warm summer afternoon.
That should be all right. You can see your notes.
So the in-stream flow rules, we've got a format of very similar to the pilot program. Describes how we're going to go about choosing the next designated rivers to be worked on, how we develop water management plans and out of the protected in-stream flow studies, and then administer those plans with various components of extensions and ongoing reporting and those things. And then a waiver process that was described by the legislature in 2016. They gave us some additional requirements under the statutes that we need to shift some of the language we had in waivers. We changed it to say specifically what they had to say under the statutes. So the process is moving forward in pre-rule making. We've been having meetings to discuss the what we think the best way to move forward with the rulemaking, but we haven't even started rulemaking. So far, we've just had these information meetings, and a week from tonight, actually a week from today, but not tonight, in the morning, next Tuesday, we'll be having the next section, which is covering the administration of the water management plans and the waiver of the rules. And then sometime, probably because of Thanksgiving and Christmas and just the need to interact with a lot of people on getting some of the language pulled together, it'll probably be sometime in early January that we'll have a final meeting where we pull all the segments together. So far, we've had like a general overview, and then we've talked about the individual components of the rules that I just showed you a list of before. We did the first 3 at one meeting and the next 2 at another meeting, and now the last 2 at this next meeting. And then final meeting will be all of the combined comments that we've had from people. What have we done about them, and how we're moving forward.
What's the waivers?
Beg pardon?
What's the waivers?
Waivers is if someone has a water management plan and they feel that it is financially unsustainable, or it might cause some negative impact on public health or safety, then there's a process for submitting paperwork that would require us to not implement their water management plan until we offset those impacts, either the unsustainable financial impacts or some public health and safety issues. So,
And are there provisions for public hearings or public input when somebody asks for a waiver?
I believe
Will the public know about it? I mean,
it is notified. There's a notification process, and if you want to take a look at the waivers in particular, the RMAC blog, and you look under the in-stream flow part of that, and it has all of the sections of the rules, the language that we're talking about, and they're not very long. They tend to be 5 pages per section, except for the in-stream flow and the water management plan parts, which are a lot more detailed. But the waiver section, a couple of pages, and it talks about how what you need to submit, and then we've asked people as part of the waiver process, if they're interested in a waiver, to come in and talk to us first so we can try to work it out with the water management plan. I mean, we're having the water management plan development discussion with the people that are the dam owners and the water users, and now with the people like you guys around of the lake. If it's a lake that's being affected, that the Lake Association would be included in the discussions about the water management plan. So we hope we never get to the point where we need a waiver, because all of those kind of issues would come up in that development process. But the legislature told us we had to do this, so what we're doing is trying to meet the letter of that law as logically as we can. But yeah, and so sometime next year, we hope to start putting together from these discussion papers they all look like rules, but they're not all written out in rule-ese exactly. So they'll have to go through an initial proposal that goes out to the public, and then it goes through a lot of legislative committee reviews and various parts. But that process won't even begin until sometime after January of next year. So it's and the waiver process does have a notification process, and I can't remember if we had a public hearing or not, but it was generally not a public hearing, but I think it went to the Water Council if there was some disargument or couldn't resolve the issues. So.
Wayne, I think it's important to note that in our new rules set is a lot of what we learned from our interactions with you all. So I think we learned, a great deal about how the original way that the public process had been set up for the program didn't work for everybody. And so I think that one of the things that we've brought into this rule set is really kind of writing in how we eventually ended up doing this. And I think that that's really, again, I just want to point that out to you. You all have suffered through this. Your suffering was well served for us in that we learned a lot from it. So I do appreciate that. And if you take a look at our rules, I think you'll see that there's lots of places in which we touch base back with people who might be affected by
I
it.
think Wayne has highlighted some of those in
Good.
the past.
Excellent.
I remember you mentioning that in different places.
The new rules have a specific part even before a river is chosen. There's a whole public interaction process to discuss it out in public hearings or public meetings anyway, that find out, you know, what's the feedback? Are people interested in this? Are they not happy about it? I mean, we're gonna have to do these anyway. I mean, they're part of the process, but, you know, there may be a selection process that moves things forward more efficiently by choosing people who are really in favor of trying to get the work done rather than, so.
I got an email from a fellow by the name of Matt Wood today, who's, I guess, is the point man for the New Hampshire DES 2018 Surface Water Quality Assessment Process, required by sections 305 and 303 of the Clean Water Act. And he's asking us for any data that we have. You have also accumulated data, both because you've done winter management, winter measurements that we haven't done, but you shared with us in terms of dissolved oxygen and so forth. And I just wanted to make sure that you're sharing that with us.
Yep.
Because I think this kind of, the problem has always been that the left hand sometimes doesn't know what the right hand is doing in government.
Yeah.
And by someone being the point man for all of the information that so many lake groups have been doing, I think we might learn even more about the behavior of, you know, luminology and how everything works.
Yep, that stuff is absolutely all the stuff we're collecting here on Pawtuckaway's getting into that report, so. Yeah, yeah, Ted mentioned the I forget what you mentioned, but basically the point was that, you know, there's a lot of stuff that we learned from you guys, but that report that we wrote in 2015 that summarized 2 years of implementation of the pilot programs, Lamprey and the Sauhegan, that report went with its recommendations to the legislature. The legislature used that report to write some of the statutes that I'm now managing, because we suggested certain changes in the statutes, and they decided which ones of those they liked and didn't, and they gave us new marching orders basically. And so that process is coming kind of full circle. It's kind of churning through the, you know, what did you like about the pilot program, what did we not like, what do we want to fix, what things can be streamlined. And these rules reflect a lot of that information that we put into that 2015 report. So now I want to move along through my stuff, because I really want to get Dave up here, because he's been actually doing some of the things that I once did, which is measuring the water levels and the flows and the concentrations in the, not only the stuff leaving the lake, but some of the stuff coming into the lake. But I do have some feedback. This was last year. I wanted to show you last year just because it's such a dramatic comparison. The red and the pink are things that are bad, basically, as far as long-term low levels of flow.
That's 2016.
This is 2016. And then there's the green lines are where we did the relief pulses with just Pawtuckaway last year, because we didn't have Mendham's. And so you can see it's pretty ragged with all the different things going on and how low the flows are relative to those orange and yellow and olive green lines that represent our flow magnitudes. But these are night and day compared to what it was this year.
Thanks for the water this year.
There was plenty of water this year. Most of the time, you can see there's a couple times when things got low, but even then, it's not below the long-term threshold. It's a short duration, and it reacted the way we'd like to see it, which is go down, get below the thresholds, that's fine, but not stay there for more than 15 or 20 days, like we had last year, and cause us to recognize a long period of stress on the habitat. So this shows you what a dramatic difference this last year has been with the rain compared to 2016.
And the drought has been officially declared over, right?
Oh, yeah, yeah. Although we had some drought or near drought conditions in Maine and down in southern New Hampshire, started getting to some extreme. You guys actually had those periods there where things were getting hydrologic drought, not necessarily soil drought, but there's lots of definitions of drought. So this is the lake.
We still, I mean, on that, we still got complaints here that some of the ponds that really went dry last summer still have not really totally recovered. So even though we had all of this rain,
Wow.
especially in the southern part of the state, there are still, conditions are still lingering from that deep drought that we were in. So, you know, it's an interesting thing that even though we have pretty good flows in our rivers, there's still some groundwater effect that appears to be lingering, at least for some period of time.
Yeah, I did notice that the small pond by the Mountain Road Trading Post was really low again, which kind of surprised me, but
It takes several years. Our groundwater recharges relatively slowly.
yeah, makes sense.
So this is Pawtuckaway this year, and you can see the purple line, which I've given you in the past, which is that median condition over 20 some odd years. So it shows that most of the time we're actually above that. So, and then the green line is the full lake level, where above that water's spilling over the dams, spillways, and below it they're not. And then the new water level that is the winter drawdown. So that was just on there from a previous slide that I actually didn't take off, but it gives you kind of a reference of how very high the flows are and staying up there nice and level compared to last year when we had, you know, some of the relief pulses, and those relief pulses I think added up to not even half of the drawdown that you see there. It was a substantially smaller part of the difference between the normal lake level and the existing lake level in 2016. So a lot better conditions on the lake. You guys are kind of probably spoiled about how the water level is so high, and but those are this year's conditions on the lake. So you can see like the river levels are higher, the lake levels are higher. Everybody's feeling pretty happy. This fall, the drawdown starting as usual, kind of that Columbus Day weekend. This will be the second year that we'll be going down to that minus 4.8. So we're just now starting really to implement the management plan. One of the things that I was trying to accomplish is to get a 30-70 split between Dolph and Drowns, and I wasn't seeing that happen, largely because Dam Bureau is very busy trying to manipulate all the dams in the state. So one of the things I suggested to them, and they're going to implement this year, is to perforate or to put some notches into some of the stop logs that are below the water level and put the stop logs back on top of them. So there'll be permanent holes in Dolph that will maintain sort of a more steady and more uniform flow rate. And I'm trying to figure out, I've done some calculations or some estimates, they're not really calculations exactly, what the appropriate amount of water to go through those holes might be, so that we don't exceed that 30% those days when they pull out the stop logs. There's a pretty good gush of water. And then as the water level drops, that water level drops to nothing and then disappears. So this would keep water flowing out during that time period until they can get back out, and so you have a continuous, so it'll also balance out. We still have an issue with the alewife migration that we're going to have to manage, so that may mean some days when we open Drowns up entirely, what they did last year, because when they have the gate at the bottom, the fish don't like to go under the gate, so they just lift the whole thing out and it just becomes a big sluice way.
Maybe you're retraining.
Yeah, we'll need to do something, but the other question is whether these notches in the stop logs would represent a place, but those are holes and they don't want to go through holes normally. But the other, you know, we may need to have the Dolph end of the lake open up earlier if the fish are schooling up there, so that they go out when they're planning to go out. But a lot will depend on the weather conditions, whether the temperatures change the right way. They're very finicky about when they go, so it's not like you can say on October 10th that's the day you want to open up. So.
Well, we were concerned about getting phosphorus out there.
Well, that was the other part of it, is I wanted to.
Or out.
I told Dan that we didn't want to overdo these the holes in the stop log, because that's one of the things that we're concerned about, is managing the mass of the phosphorus out the north end of the lake, not out of the south end. But last year we only did, I think, 5%. I gave you numbers in the spring, but I forget off the top of my head what I said. But I think they were like 2 years ago it was only 10% of the flow going out of Dolph, and last year was even less because of the way the water level was. I think Dam Bureau was more busy and didn't go out as often, but also because the lake level was down and less water went out that way anyway. And we were playing with the alewife openings, so some of that was very, very scattered. It would be a big pulse of water and nothing for days on end. So this is one way to balance it out with these perforated stop logs, but we also have to remember the alewife, and then we also try to make sure that we maximize our phosphorus export. So.
These perforations are at or above the 4.8 level?
They would be, well, the lake level starts off at 0, and so on the first days you may pull out one stop log out of each of the bays, pull out 2 more stop logs and put a new perforated log in for that second one, so it'd be underwater by, 12.
Above the 4.8 level.
It will be above the 4.8 level, yeah. So that would be, but as they move down, so now you've got 4 stop logs, four logs out from each bay, it would be the second one underneath that. So the lake level will go down, the stop logs will get moved every time they go out there to adjust it. So
Will these be removed in the spring?
they would be out, I think, when, I guess we haven't really thought about how we would manage this, but my thought was that by the time we get down to the 4.8 level, we would probably take them out altogether and just leave the stop logs in at whatever flow is sufficient to keep that level constant through the.
But if somebody takes the existing logs, put holes in them, next spring they'll just.
Oh, they would take them out in the spring when they refill, probably. I mean, there's a lot of nuanced things that we could do to manage the flow, both balancing the outflow in the spring that's supposed to be going down the rivers with the filling of the lake. And this year we had that, just perfectly vertical. Nearly the lake level came up within such a very short period of time. And if they had allowed the holes to be in the stop logs, then it wouldn't have slowed that dramatically at all. We did the calculation last year on that 90 gallons a minute leaking out of drowns, and it really only adds up to 3 months of that 90 gallons a minute only added up to less than half an inch of water level in Pawtuckaway Lake. So I mean, these are like going to be around 10 CFS is what I'm estimating would be leaving the lake, and the lake is filling up a lot faster than that. So this would
You have a set with holes and a set without holes.
right.
So
These would be ones that you could swap them in to fit the circumstances.
My
And
recollection is that ground stem didn't actually not go down that far.
the what didn't?
My recollection is that drought dam, because of an older coffin dam that was in front of it, didn't actually get down to that level.
Now it does.
Stopped draining somewhere around minus.
It was minus 5.4.
Yeah, right.
So now we're going to be at minus 4.8 though, so that flow will continue out through the winter like we did last year. I think I did the calculation of beyond the common period that I used to do. I used to do from October, sometime October 10th, I think, to December 3rd was the period that I was able to measure before that stopped flowing. So that's what I did, but then because last year was the first year we actually could have flow continuing out the full year, I extended that measurement and we got a substantial amount. I think it was 70 pounds of phosphorus that went out during that period that wouldn't have gone out if we dropped the lake level down and only had it coming out the other end of the lake.
So, Wayne, in the fall, right, you put some combination of solid and perforated stop logs in there as the lake goes down.
Yeah.
To maintain a more continuous flow. Now it gets down to the minus 4.8 level.
Yeah.
All perforated logs are out of there?
I haven't really thought that through, I guess. So yes, normally that would happen. The question would be, would Dam Bureau say it's simpler for us to just leave them there because we have to go and pull a stop log out? They usually have a stop log out in the middle anyway. So to have 3 perforated logs that are at some level that keep it steady rather than having it change up and down, it might be simpler for them.
I don't know the physical principle of pulling them out, but I was just wondering about in the spring, if we get another spring like we had this spring and the lake level goes way up,
Yeah.
can you get that perforated log out of there with the lake level much higher?
That is a question, and that might be a concern that they would have, and I would, that's some of the things I should discuss with Dam Bureau. But I know when they did the first year, they tried to do a big release out of drowns, and we still had the stop logs there. They pulled, I think, 5 stop logs, and those guys were pretty brawny, but it was like, you're pulling logs that
I know, the pressure.
under the pressure of that water and so we don't want to. That's why the gate got put in there. Nobody wants to have these guys injured, by trying to do that kind of work. So again, that would have to be a consideration, I think, is if Dam Bureau feels that wouldn't be appropriate. But they're still gonna have to pull those or add stop logs to that. They could add stop logs, but they wouldn't be able to get them out again later on if they buried them. So that's
my concern.
and that would be an issue. So I think that might mitigate for just pulling them out and not having to
Just
worry.
having solid logs in there.
It's one of those things that this idea came about because we recognized that there was a problem and now we're adjusting to it. If this comes up, and that would be another problem, if the spring flows need to be managed with perforated or without perforated, then we need to try to think through that process and make a decision that makes sense.
And if we don't pull them out, it could impact the winter flows or keep that level, higher than that minus 4.8.
Well, last year it bounced up, remember? So.
Right, and if we have perforated logs there, it could be
Well, yeah, I'm not sure how it,
Well, you know, because there's some, I mean, yeah, it's gonna let some through, but.
it may not be as much as, it wouldn't be as much as it would be if you pull the logs. So this is one of those things where when you get a melt, things are gonna change no matter what you do, and you gotta be able to manage it. And they went out, I think, just before they were planning on starting to fill the lake. They had that big melt and the big either rain or a lot of water came in all at once, and that's why it went nearly straight up. But they had like a little period just before that where things bounced up and then leveled off and then went shooting up again. So they had to manage that earlier than they had planned to, but it was one of those things that were going to start later because of the already existing low levels of, that was the drawdown, not the fill, other way around. So, but they had to get out there and start managing it based on the conditions, and that's what they have to do now. If the water level goes up above that 4.8, we need to come open things up a little bit. If it starts falling down below, we need to make sure things are tightened up so that there's less going out. So, here's Mendham's. Brand new source of water that we've got for now. Now their water level is back to being full. You can see the green line was where the normal winter flows would have been drawn down to, and of course they had it completely drained for almost 2 years. So now we've got Mendham's available to us for summer releases. And then there's Dave Simon's study. This is one of these water level loggers that's out next to the Drowns staff gauge out there in the stream below the Drowns.
That's where I take the water test.
That's one of the water collection locations, yeah.
Right on the footbridge?
I go right next to that thing, it's just running.
Nice.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna move to Dave's slides here, and he's gonna step in and tell you about what he's been doing.
I mean, I know you're not part of the dam here, but what do you know the overall status of both the dams in terms of their condition and repair status and things like that?
Not their repair status, but if I ask them stuff, they will tell me that. But
I mean, are they in good shape, lousy shape, excellent shape?
I think they're in fine shape yet. I don't think there's any issues as far as deficits, and as far as I know, that both the dams are working the way they expect them to, and they don't have any significant maintenance issues or anything like that. Yeah. At least they haven't mentioned anything to me. I haven't specifically asked, but I would have thought they would have said, you know, the Mendham's Pond thing, obviously we knew about the gate, and the gate was, you know, a problem with and they've been working to replace that. They're still doing little tweaks on that now to make it work the way they want it to, but I think they're done, either done now or about done with whatever, because they had to put a coffer dam up in front of that in order to operate and build, and then they were operating to pull that out. I don't know all the details of it, but there's been quite a lot of continued efforts on that. So Dave Simon, UNH master's student, he's been working in there, and I'll let him tell you about it.
Great, thanks Wayne. Should I stand or sit or?
Whatever you want to do.
All right. Oh yeah. So hi everyone. Thank you for inviting me tonight, Wayne. It's really nice to be a part of this. And I'm excited to share with you some work that I've done at Pawtuckaway over the summer and talk about some more work that I'll be doing over the course of the next 8 months. So this is just in the beginning stages of my project for my master's thesis. And I'd like to talk a little bit about my master's thesis project before I get into some of the details about specifically what I've been doing at Pawtuckaway Lake. First off, I'd like to acknowledge that this thesis work is funded by the National Science Foundation and is part of the New England Sustainability Consortium's Future of Dams project, which seeks to provide scientific information to help communities weigh trade-offs of different dam decisions. So specifically, my work is looking into the effects dams have on the retention of nutrients, specifically nitrogen, within a watershed, as well as their effect on the frequency and magnitude of high and low flows downstream of a dam, and then how can we use dams as a tool to help combat some potential consequences of climate change and land use change in the future. So I'm going to be answering these big research questions by estimating changes in nitrogen flux and discharge as a result of different dam management scenarios for the Lamprey River watershed through computer modeling. And
Dave,
then,
I'm going to interrupt only.
Sure.
What's the significance of nitrogen in the biology?
I think I'll have that answered in just a couple slides.
Okay.
But if I don't, I'll be sure to answer that. So yeah, I'm going to be modeling the Lamprey River watershed for nitrogen flux and discharge for different dam management scenarios. But I'd like to talk a little bit about nitrogen retention and how it relates to dams. Nitrogen is an important nutrient for primary productivity, and it enters into a river network from many different sources, such as the atmosphere through wet and dry deposition, or from overland runoff or groundwater flow. However, only a small portion of this nitrogen that enters into a river or reservoir actually flows down the network and leaves into the ocean, as a majority is retained or removed by the river network. And this retention by nitrogen from the river network is a really important ecosystem service, especially helping to prevent eutrophication at downstream estuaries, such as the Great Bay, and I'll be talking a little bit about that as well. For this presentation, I'll be referring to nitrogen retention within a river, a reservoir, as just the difference between the nitrogen inputs and outputs. So nitrogen can be retained within a river or a reservoir by a few different pathways, such as denitrification. It can be buried in the sediment, or it can be consumed by plants or algae. However, most of it is denitrified. In fact, most of it is denitrified. If you're not quite sure what denitrification is.
Not at all, sure.
Sure. It's the anaerobic process, so low oxygen process, by which nitrate is converted to nitrogenous gas, where it can then exit a water body as a gas into the atmosphere. Dam reservoirs are especially hotspots for nitrogen retention because they usually increase water depth, have low oxygen conditions at the bottom, have increased organic material storage, and increased residence times of the water they stored. Thus, these conditions all promote denitrification, and therefore reservoirs have been shown to increase the amount of nitrogen retained as compared to a free-flowing river channel.
This nitrogen, is it an input as a gas or as a compound?
So it can leave as a gas. It's usually an input from overland runoff, so it could be like, it's usually dissolved in water, so it can flow into the river through any of these hydrologic pathways.
Dissolves in water and then it becomes
Mobile.
oxide or something.
And that's how it gets into the river network.
How long does it take to denitrification process take?
How long does it take?
Yeah.
I think it's fairly quickly. It's constantly happening, depending on seasons. It's temperature dependent, so usually have more denitrification occurring in warmer months. And it's a substantial portion of nitrogen inputs that are denitrified and exit into the atmosphere. So I was going to give a relevant example. So the lamprey drains to the Great Bay Estuary, which is a coastal estuary. And that has recently been declared impaired for nitrate. I have this figure over here from the 2013 status of the estuaries. This is a prep report. As you can see, there's an increasing trend in dissolved inorganic nitrogen concentration within the Great Bay over the past 30 years. And this has led to some negative effects, such as eelgrass habitat declining and invasive macroalgae species proliferating, which has caused a host of issues. So understanding nitrogen retention in the lamprey is important because it directly affects water quality in the Great Bay, which is in part one of the reasons why I chose to model the lamprey. And speaking of modeling, in order to make sure that the model that I'm using is accurately estimating nitrogen retention in these reservoirs within the lamprey, I've decided to calculate nitrogen retention at one reservoir, and that brings us to Pawtucket Lake. So I chose Pawtucket Lake for a couple of reasons. It's the largest reservoir in the lamprey. This is a figure of how the model calculates nitrogen retention based on depth of water, based on the ratio of water depth to residence time. I plotted Pawtucket, or what it expects Pawtucket will have for nitrogen retention, which is fairly high, which is another reason why I chose Pawtucket. And because there's a plethora of water quality data that's been collected by DES and volunteers, and which I'll try to be utilizing and hopefully adding to. And based on some of this historic data, which I'll go into a little more detail later on, nitrogen flux entering and leaving Pawtucket Lake varies somewhat by season because denitrification is temperature dependent, like I stated earlier. So we see highest fluxes of nitrogen entering and leaving during winter months. So in order to capture this change in seasonal variability between nitrogen inputs and outputs, I'm going to be conducting this study from over the course of a year. So I started back in May 2017, and I'll be taking samples until April 2018. So here I have a map of where I'm currently sampling. In order to calculate nitrogen retention in Pawtucket, I'll be estimating all nitrogen inputs and outputs from the lake. And since nitrogen is transported through water, the flow of water, I'll also be estimating all water entering and leaving the lake over this period as well. I'm currently measuring flow at 4 tributaries and flow into the lake at 4 tributaries and outflow downstream of both of the dam outlets. And I'll be periodically collecting and will continue to collect water samples from each of these locations, which I've labeled on the map in the red triangles. And I'll be sampling for ammonium and nitrite plus nitrate, which make up dissolved inorganic nitrogen. And because phosphorus monitoring has been and continues to be an important practice at Pawtucket, I'm also monitoring for total phosphorus as well. And once I have a measurement of flow, also called discharge, and concentration of each of these measurements or parameters, either for nitrogen or phosphorus, I can multiply them together to get a mass flux for each nutrient. So I chose the 4 tributaries. I chose Back Creek B, Round Pond Brook, and Mountain Cove Brook because they're by far the largest tributaries that drain to the Pawtucket Lake. I think they make up around 3/4 of all inflowing tributary water to Pawtucket. And I've also chosen to monitor Fernald's Brook A on the other side of the lake because it drains Fernald's Farm and has historically seen higher levels of both nitrogen and phosphorus in this tributary.
Really?
Yes, extremely high. So once I get a measurement on flux for each of these 4 tributaries, I'll then estimate flux at all these other remaining tributaries based on drainage area. And the other nitrogen flux inputs to the lake, such as atmospheric deposition, groundwater seepage, overland runoff, and internal sediment loading or sediment release, I'll be estimating from previously developed models using land cover and precipitation data.
Okay, come back to my question. Is it good or bad to have a high nitrogen retention?
It's good because most of that retention is being removed from denitrification. So it's not actually being stored within the lake, it's being removed back to the atmosphere. Therefore, it can't flow downstream and cause
Algae in Great Bay.
excessive loading and eutrophication.
In other words, high nitrogen leads to algae?
Yes, but high nitrogen retention leads to less nitrogen.
Because of
Denitrification.
There'll be a quiz.
So good for Great Bay, but what's the impact on Pawtucket?
So I'm trying to quantify this ecosystem service that Pawtucket is giving to Great Bay because there's quite a bit of denitrification occurring at Pawtucket. And I guess, so I'm trying to quantify that so I can use that in the model that I'm going to be running for the whole watershed. So if anyone had in the future was wondering how managing the dams on Pawtucket might affect nitrogen loading to Great Bay, this is a good start to that question.
But I think the answer to the question, though, that he was asking is generally speaking, phosphorus is the limiting nutrient in lakes.
Mm-hmm.
And so, but some of that, there's a body of knowledge that's now suggesting that nitrogen is also not that great in freshwater and can have effects on things like milfoil and other things. So, and cyanobacteria in particular, seems to have some relationship to nitrogen inputs. So the better you're capable of
Denitrifying.
processing that nitrogen, the better off you are in your lake. And that would be, I think, an interesting study at some point, is to see if some lakes are better than others at that and whether or not that has any effect on cyano. But I think that's kind of the other factor that's going on.
Mm-hmm.
When we started this, and in the years that we've been water testing, and I think Wayne has something to say about it, because I remember way back when we first started looking at the outflows, we weren't finding unnecessarily high levels relative to other outflows through outside of the lake.
Of nitrogen?
It probably supports your idea that there's quite a bit of high level of retention.
Mm-hmm.
And when you say retention, so that Pawtucket specifically wasn't necessarily named as the poster child for the culprit of the problem that Great Bay seems to have. They've been talking about nitrogen
Oh, yeah.
for some time. And of course, there's a lot of other things that feed into Great Bay. There's other rivers and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
When you say retention, are you saying that it's retained, yes, it's retained as a soluble in the water. It's also retained in the plants.
So that's correct. So what I'm saying about retention is retained or stored in plant material under the sediment, but also removed. Because I'm not going to be able to, as you we'll find out. I'm not going to be able to actually quantify how much is being removed, so I'm lumping it in with that term
Trying to
retention.
make it fit first.
So
Sure.
basically, it's not getting past the dams.
Exactly.
That's
And
what
it-
you're trying to decide.
Yeah.
Will it approve or disapprove?
So the increased nitrogen levels in Great Bay has inhibited eelgrass.
Mm.
I'm surprised because nitrogen is the component fertilizer and that usually helps green things grow. Why does nitrogen inhibit eelgrass?
I think it's being outcompeted with other species, which in turn has led to degradation of its habit or of the eelgrass. So while I'm still on the slide, if there's no more questions at this moment, I'd like to just point out the other couple sampling sites I'll be pulling water samples from. So I'm also taking an in-lake water sample site over here, just above Dolph Dam, just to compare it to this downstream sampling site, just so I can see if there's any sort of groundwater influence on samples taken downstream of the dam. And I'm also taking samples at the 2 USGS gauges within Lamprey to kind of compare nitrogen flux of the upper watershed to the lower watershed. So I'll be taking those at the gauge at Langford Road in Raymond, and also at the gauge at Packers Falls near Newmarket. So that brings me to the actual field work at Pawtuckaway, which I started over this summer.
One question.
Yes.
Say the lake is providing nitrogen retention services
Uh-huh.
to what's happening downstream.
Yes.
Is there any body of work that says, okay, if we reach a certain threshold, something bad happens?
I don't think something bad well, most of the nitrogen that is being retained isn't sticking around in Pawtuckaway. It's leaving into the atmosphere through denitrification.
And that's a relatively big number.
Yes, that's most of it. Some studies have shown that it's up to 60 to 80%.
And that's,
And that's leaving as a nitrogen gas.
Yes, nitrogenous gas.
and that's because it's being retained.
Um,
It produces that.
Yeah, so
Okay.
because residence times are a little bit longer in reservoirs, it's giving more opportunity for that nitrogen to interact with the bottom sediment and then be denitrified.
There's a bunch of chemical reactions going on in
Exactly, yep. Did that answer your question?
the lake. Yeah, yes,
Okay.
it answered that.
So I started in May 2017, just last May, doing some field work at Pawtuckaway with my undergrad assistant Brady over here. And we started at each of the 4 tributaries and the 2 outlets to gauge each of these streams for discharge. And what that started with was the deployment of a pressure logger, seen in this picture over here. And so this is a very small instrument that is just recording the pressure of the water column and the atmosphere above it. And then we also deployed a barometric pressure logger next to one of the streams. And by taking the difference of the two, you can find the height of the water column above the, a in-stream pressure logger, which otherwise known as stage. So here's a picture of some of the housing or equipment that we use to make sure the logger stays where it's supposed to stay, which isn't always the case. And these are some other measurements that we took at each of the logger locations over the course of the summer. So once the loggers are in place, then we take discharge. We take discharge using the velocity area method, using an acoustic Doppler velocimeter. That's what Brady is holding right here, attached to a weighting rod. And by taking a profile of the velocity along the width of the stream finding the area of the stream in each of those intervals, and then summing those up, you can have discharge at that location. And so we took discharge at each logger location a couple times over the summer at different flows, and anytime you're taking water samples. And here's a picture of Brady filtering a water sample when we took them in late July. And so unfortunately, I don't have, I haven't received any water quality data back from the lab yet. However, I'll show you I'll show you the process by which I'm creating this continuous measurement of discharge. So here's a time series of logger stage at the Back Creek B tributary. And as you can see in the blue, stream stage increases and decreases due to the response from storm events. And you can see that it's, the height of the stream is lowering in the drier summer months. So I have data up until August 2017, and I plan on continually taking data through April 2018. It might be difficult during the winter, but I'm going to try to get data as continuous as possible. Oh, sorry, I forgot to mention, these loggers are taking data at 5-minute intervals. And then these red bars are when I've sampled, taken water samples, and when I plan to take water samples moving forward. So, in order to find nutrient flux, I need discharge rather than stage. And to do this, I develop a stage discharge relation, or stage discharge curve, or line, where I find a best fit line from the relationship between discharge and stage from each of these measurements taken throughout the summer. And then having this best fit line, I can then transform my time series of stage into a time series of discharge. And then once I have nutrient concentration data, I can do a similar sort of analysis between discharge and concentration of nitrogen and phosphorus, which might look something like this. This is a figure of discharge and nitrate concentration taken in the lamprey at the Lee Hook Road over in Lee. And as you can see, discharge has a weak diluting relationship with nitrate concentration. So as discharge increases, as discharge increases, concentration decreases. And I expect to find a similar relationship in each of the tributaries that I'm currently monitoring. Once I develop this relationship for each location, I can then transform that time series of discharge into a time series of nutrient flux. Here's a example of flux of nitrate that it might look something like, which I can then use to find total flux of nitrate at Back Creek B, entering Pawtuckaway. And then I'll do these same steps for each inlet and outlet that I'm monitoring. And then I'd like to end by showing you a slide of some nitrate flux data that I've taken from a study that was done by DES back in the early 90s, where they did something similar. They measured nitrate flux at all the tributaries and outlets over the course of the study year. And I also plan to do something along this line. But in addition, I also plan on estimating some of those other unknown fluxes, such as atmospheric deposition, overland runoff, groundwater seepage, and release from sediments within the lake. And a lot has changed since the early 90s, some of which has been dam management. So I'm interested to compare what I find to some of these numbers. And sorry, these are summed up, these are total flux for that whole study year. And as you can see, Fernald's Brook is quite large. Yeah, so I'm going to be comparing what I find to some of these estimates. And then hopefully, by estimating nitrogen retention in Pawtuckaway, I can validate the relationship in my model, or at least have some uncertainty with nutrient or nitrogen retention in the reservoirs in my model. So that's it for slides. Thank you all for listening.
Well done.
Cool.
There is an email. Feel free to contact me going forward if you have any questions or concerns.
I understand the data you're gathering, the purpose, but one of your goals was to figure out how dam management plans could affect this.
Mm-hmm.
And you only went, 1 year is not enough to, you don't have a lot of variability in the dam management plan. You have a dam management plan, and you have a lot of other variables, you plan rainfall, and the weather, temperature, and so forth. So your goal of trying to determine how dam management plans affect this is going to be difficult to attain.
It would be with just 1 year. However, I'm using, I'll be using a model. So this will, I can simulate nitrogen and water flow in Pawtuckaway for longer than just a year using a model. And I'll be doing that for the whole Lamprey River watershed. Not just at Pawtuckaway, at all reservoirs in the watershed. So thank you all.
So what's next? As we move out of our current agreement schedule, we're still here. We're not gone. We're still at the office. We'll still be taking your calls. We'll be still managing the dams for maintaining the best phosphorus balance and the best water levels that we can. But here's some of the other people. I think we've met some of these people. Darlene Forrest came and talked about repairing the docks and what kind of questions you might have as far as permitting and need for making any kind of changes or corrections to your dock after you've had some damage. Amy Smagula is still coming out. She's going to be doing the aquatic plant surveys. We've talked, because last year was the first year we were at the minus 4.8 level. This would be the first year of actual new data we've had 3 years before this where we had the sonar, the boat ride around to measure the depths and the plant concentration or concentrations, and also her spot sampling of actual plant densities. So she'll still be doing that for this year. Is she doing it already? Yeah, she'll be doing it very soon. That'll be year one, and then we'll be doing it 3 years altogether. After that, there'll be a 5-year gap, and then 3 continuous years, and a 5-year gap and 3 continuous years. That way we have the best distribution for biological assessments, because if you do 1 year and then 5 years and then 5 years and 5 years, you kind of get that variability. You don't know whether you're on a peak or a low. So we've kind of focused 3 years in a row to get a sense of where things stand, and then the next 3 years. And this is going to take a long time, obviously, to develop sufficient data to generate, well, is the trend going up or trend going down, because you're going to have kind of spotty levels of data during those 3 years, another clump of data here, another clump of data there. But we hope that this will be the best combination of data density that will generate a sense of whether or not we're getting trends or not. So Amy will still be doing this year and the next 2 years, then 5 years off, and then doing it again for another 3 years. Sarah Steiner is still going to be doing the VLAP program, still going to be doing water quality measurements out in the field. I don't know if you're familiar with Amanda McQuaid, but she's been doing our cyanobacteria things for the last year or so, year and a half maybe. Tracy here is the lakes manager. I'll be working with Dan Bureau to manage the outflows during the any kind of releases that we need for a leaf pulse or for the drawdowns, and managing how we deal with both the concentrations of phosphorus and deal with getting the alewife out of the lake and making sure the salt goes as smoothly as we can get it. So we're still here, we'll still be doing this stuff, but not nearly as intensively in meeting with you. But you have our phone number there. That one number will get you through to anybody with those names. So that'll be, and of course you got my direct number and access to me.
Well, after our agreement expires,
Yeah.
Will we still be getting notice when there's going to be a pulse release for a drought or any other?
Yep, we still plan to do all that stuff, notifications about any, if we see that there's a leaf pulse that's likely to happen, notify you with as much warning as we've got, make a certain,
That's very helpful for us,
Yeah.
as you know.
Sure.
That's what some of the feedback has been, is our, what's going on.
No
We don't know what's
surprises.
going on.
Well,
We
this is-
start to panic and then the phone is off the hook.
this is what we, this is the kind of things we learned talking with you, is that these are things you're interested in having, so we're trying to make sure that continues. Yeah. Steve?
What is your relationship to dam management? Says, in other words, you're not the boss of the dams, right?
No, not in any
Now,
sense.
Ted, are you the boss of the dams?
I'm not the boss of the dams either.
Who is?
Jim Gallagher is the boss of the dams.
And in a hierarchy, who's over him then?
He and I are at the same level.
Uh-huh.
And our boss, we have the same boss. So he and I, we talk, a great deal, and our staff work together a great deal, yeah.
So in terms of one hand talking to the other, do they listen to you, Wayne?
Oh, yeah, I talked to Dan Matini, he's the one that actually manages the guys that pull stop logs and put stop logs back. Last year, I said, this isn't really working for me, how the flows coming out of Dolph aren't really balanced with the ones that drown, and I suggested this perforated stop log, and Dan said, I'm so busy, I can't talk to you right now, come back in 6 months. So I did. So we did that, but he's been very responsive to that, and when we talk about the relief pulses, I tell him, we need a certain amount of flow, and he calculates how big a stop log he needs, and that's, we work collaboratively on trying to make this work as well as possible, and it's...
Jim Gallagher really understands this lake. He's had his attention here for a long time. Back when I did the ping pong balls,
The famous ping pong balls.
He was the dam guy.
Yeah.
But he understood the behaviors, and he understood, where the high spots were and the low spots. He understood the money really well.
The dam guys actually kind of like this stuff.
Oh, yeah.
It's a little, it's a little different.
Throws a little wrinkle into their day.
And so they actually, for them, it's kind of fun. So, it's why they went into the dam management stuff, because they were the same little kids that would go out in the back stream.
Big pop balls, those little kids.
And see what happens. He should have been a dam engineer. Instead of a dam real estate agent.
Yeah, Dan Matini's really good. He's been he's the chief of he's under Jim. He's next level down, and actually he really is a hydrologist as well as an engineer. So he understands the flow of water. So when I talk to him, he can calculate things up like you
He's
wouldn't.
the guy we used to call.
Yeah, and pester him.
Had some concern.
Well,
Now we call you.
he hears it from everybody. There's too much, there's too little, both on the same day. So yeah, so it's.
So I'm feeling, is this a swan song? You're saying, this is the names. Are we not going to have regular meetings with you?
Well, this is the agreement goes through September of 2017. That was what we had set together. So we're like I was saying, though, we're not leaving you. We're just not going to be as intensively involved. So
But I'm hoping maybe we get invited to maybe an annual meeting once in a while, because we do present at Lake Association annual meetings, and I think that this is where I'm hoping we've gotten to is a place in which we have a level of trust that we've developed over the years, and that we can be responsive as we are to other lakes, and that if there's issues we can deal with them, and if you want something in the newsletter, you know who to call. And one thing I was gonna recommend is I think that maybe what would be good, is we started all of this, the agreement part with a meeting with the commissioner. I think it might be nice to kind of culminate it that way as well, where maybe we get a few of you and we meet in Concord, or we bring the commissioner down and just, you know, kind of talk through, here's what we learned, here's where we went.
It's a great idea.
I think that would be a nice
I
way.
think that would be a good idea, but
Yeah, no, I think
as
so
I've
too.
been suggesting to you, I think that a modified agreement, that sort of participation agreement, achieves a couple of things that we may think will continue without one. But I think one of the things that it has done is, and I think part of you look at the body count of this number, and most of the board members of the PLIA and our strongest volunteers, frankly, don't know what's left, is that because we have a partnership agreement in place, I think that our constituents here at the PLIA trust us to keep the relationship going, because we have one, and it's formalized in a participation agreement. And even if it were modified so that, I mean, you would always come if we said, come to the annual meeting, or, you know, would you come down and talk to us next September? Let's just see how it's going. I'm sure you'd be happy to, you know, I mean, people come down, Amy's been everybody's been great that way, but there's something about, to me, there's something about the formal relationship of give and take, or reporting, or flow, that I think serves a purpose, and I think it also sets an example. I don't know your relationship with other lakes, but there was a lot of opposition 3 years ago.
No, I think it
And
proved
now there's
itself to be
cooperation.
it did prove itself to be very valuable, and I guess the only hesitation I have on this at all, Tom, is just that, there are 999 other lakes, in the state, and so one of the things that we just have to do is manage our resources and manage our expectations, and so this was a great opportunity for us to really ramp up, to address the concerns. We learned a lot from it. I think you all learned a lot from it. And I think that the idea is to have a more sort of normal relationship moving forward. But again, I think let's have a meeting with the commissioner. Let's chat with him about it. I mean, this is a unique animal. We've
Yeah.
not ever done this
And
kind of
it's a new
agreement.
And we have a history.
And we have I get that. And so I think, you know, let's have that conversation. I think that would be a good one. And let's, you know, and see
I'd
where
like
we
to
go.
have that conversation.
Yeah. So coming out of this, we'll try to set something up, and you let us know who you want to invite, and we'll make that happen.
Yeah, because the idea of having a partnership agreement that doesn't necessarily require, you know, semi-annual presentations
Right.
and data and all that other stuff, might be possible, just to ensure that there is that channel of information that's not gonna like disappear.
Yeah, I think
When
it's
personnel changes. I mean, I know, we know you guys, well, what if you're not there, what if, you know, we change our, it makes us possibly nervous that we're not gonna have that.
Special relationship. We're losing a special relationship.
Well, I'm not personally nervous, but I think
No,
it's.
I think we trust it because we're the ones that interact with it. But we have a constituency behind us, and they have become, I think they've become passive about it because we're doing such a great job, not only keeping the relationship, but managing the weeds, funding a lake post program, you know, stopping weeds from coming in. I mean, we have a really strong organization. This PLIA has never been stronger, certainly in my mind. And as a result, I think that there's a lot of harmony and lack of grumbling, you know, about the state on the lake. It wasn't always a good relationship.
Maybe we could come up with a proposal for how we could continue some kind of partnership, you know, on a looser basis that would not be so, as you said, you know, intense.
Or maybe just some other things that we might want to just agree to, whether it's an agreement or not.
Right.
The tool doesn't really matter, it's the effect that we get at the end. So, but yeah, we can chat more about that. But I think, again, I'm looking at resources. And thinking
We understand
about,
that.
you know, sort of fairness and equity and,
Absolutely.
you know, those kinds of things. So that's my only concern, not that I don't love meeting with you folks.
And we don't need to come to these meetings either.
And
As long as we know we have that information channel that, you know, I just asked about a little while ago. That's what's most important.
And Ted will still take you out in a boat.
Dennis?
Who does the DES Twitter?
I think it's.
Does what?
Jim Martin does the Twitter?
Oh, I'm pretty sure that would be him.
Yeah, that's Jim, yeah.
There's a couple of different people that
Are there a
have
couple of
access to the accounts.
Okay.
It depends on sort of the topic area.
Well, because I tweeted about the,
Cox Conserve.
the Cox Conserve
Hero.
Hero, vote for Neil right here. And I tagged NHDES, but didn't hear anything back, so, you know, spread the word. We need to vote for Neil to get us an extra
We're not,
$5,000.
we're not allowed to use computers there, so.
Okay, here's what my question is. When we went through all of this, we identified that if the water level drops in the river to below a certain point, then you're gonna say, okay, we need to do a pulse. There was some language in there that also said that the water users were supposed to do certain things, but I think we identified that it seemed like that language was kind of weak to make sure that those people were reducing their water usage. Voluntary. Whatever it said. And then there was also one that said, okay, UNH, for example, or I can't remember if it was UNH, if the water level then got up to a certain point, they could start filling their ponds again, even though it might only last 2 seconds, but if they hit that point, has any of that language, any place been corrected or looked at, or what's happening to take care of some of those problems?
I'm not sure I'd characterize things as direly as you've got them, but we haven't changed the water management plans, but UNH has been following their plan, and when we notified the water users before, when the water level was getting down to one of those lines there, it wasn't even at that line yet, they said, I expect that we're going to be down in the next few days. We sent out a notification to all the water users, and the next morning, UNH stopped using the river altogether. They just got off the river. So they have been responsive and doing exactly what we expected them to do. The management plans are developed based on what kind of a response would actually have an effect. So we haven't asked people to do things that we don't think will have an effect on stream flow. So the point is that the water management plans say things are voluntary in the early stages when the water levels are at some certain level, and then as things become more progressively dire, then they take even more dramatic responses. So that hasn't had to happen. We did have people on water bans, so there was no outside watering. Those things were happening last year, and so those things are actually in effect, and they are taking place. So I think that some of the things that we've asked people to do, those things are being done.
Has UNH added the extra additional wells that they were supposed to?
They did put those wells in, and they feed water into them when the water levels are high in the river, and they take water out of it when the flows were low, like they were last year, and like they did this summer when the flows got down to 16. It wasn't even a duration thing, and as soon as it hits that actual level, they stop taking water out of the river altogether, and they rely on their wells then. So
In fact, UNH also implemented a website where you can look directly on a near real-time basis.
15 minutes.
Every 15 minutes, that's pretty near to real time. To see what they're actually withdrawing from the Lamprey. So you can go on the website and you can check that out yourself. So
it shows the water level in Wiswall Dam too, because that's one of the criteria for them managing their withdrawals, that they can't lower that. It's like a big bathtub in the middle with a pipe running through it. The Lamprey River flows in, the Lamprey River flows out.
That's new news, that's something to look at.
yeah, and just in terms of last year's drought, I think I've told the story a number of times around the state, is that in the Lamprey, the people here were already preparing for the drought a month ahead of everywhere else because of this program. So by the time the drought actually got proclaimed a drought, people in the Lamprey were already doing drought management for a month because we had these indicators, these lines, as you mentioned. Once you get below that, we start to understand you're abnormally dry. And so people were up here already behaving as if there were a drought long before the drought actually got to the
What's
point.
the monitoring or enforcement mechanism for people to be, the ones who are supposed to be, conserving? Who monitors them to see if they are, I'm not talking about UNH, but other.
Conservation plans are monitored and managed by the Drinking Water and Groundwater Bureau, because we had a conservation plan in the original pilot rules, and then at the same time, the legislature said we need to have a conservation program statewide. Well, they applied it, not statewide, but in little spots as new users came on, they applied. But what we said was it's ridiculous for us to have our in-stream flow water conservation program and then to have this other statewide program that we both need to be doing similar things. So we just said, we're gonna drop ours off the table and just say, if you meet their water conservation requirements, then you're doing what we expect.
So they monitor.
So
If
they
we found that somebody wasn't following their water management plan, the law says you have to do that. It's what you have to do once it's put into place. So we would handle that just like any other violation of what we do.
So they would
So
have to
they-
report it?
we'd get
if we
we'd
found out or
Somebody would report it.
Yeah, and it's
There's
interesting
no other
because-
mechanism. for
Well, there are,
overseeing.
because, Wayne is addicted to the hydrographs. The gauge readings
Yeah,
that come
yeah.
from US to US. And we see weird stuff, and he finds weird stuff that goes on. We can see it in the numbers. And we go out and explore, and I can identify, especially when flows get low like that, we can tell a lot of times if somebody is doing something untoward.
Filling
to
too
the
many
river.
swimming pools and.
So, that's-
operating and storing and releasing water for hydropower when
Yeah.
they're not supposed to be, when they're supposed to be letting it run
And
through.
Closing down a student riot at UNH
Yeah.
Like that, yeah.
during low flow.
Believe me, when
Write that into
water
the-
levels get really low, and we found this out last summer, is that if people saw things they thought were right, they were calling us. We got
I bet that's
so
right.
many phone calls
Yeah.
about trucks pulling up
Yeah.
and filling up
Hundreds.
water. Hundreds of calls,
Oh,
hundreds.
Okay, yeah, I'm sure.
And so, it's pretty clear, I think, that under those circumstances, that, in fact, some of these cause laws to change in the state. When everybody else in the town was on a watering ban, everyone's lawn was dead, and yet McDonald's was still, going
Yeah.
full bore on their watering.
Yeah.
Or other, especially chain restaurants and chain stores that have management outside of state, they didn't understand the situation, and so we have some new laws to try
Well,
to
they
address
didn't.
that.
I bet they did.
So, you have some of that kind of situation that went on, and, so anyway, we can tell. The interesting thing, getting back to nitrates, they can also tell in Durham when the bars get out by the nitrates that enter the wastewater treatment plant. It's true. So it's a very funny phenomenon.
I think that's about all we want to know.
I think.
More than you wanted to know.
Oh, great.
So that was all I had. Thank you.
Okay, I'm a teacher.
Well, thanks for all your help.
You
Yeah,
have
we
to
learned
start
a lot,
off
and we
with
expect to learn a lot more.
why
Studies are
nitrogen is
ongoing.
important.
You're
In other words,
gonna it's all gonna continue.
A lot of people
Excited
know
about,
that
about
phosphorus is
Matt Wood,
bad,
what
and
they're doing in terms of surface
this group
waters,
has been,
because
learned about
it's
that.
really hard to understand.
But the role of
the
nitrogen
big
in
picture.
the
You know,
life
you can
cycle
study
is
nitrogen
important.
and say it does this,
And-
but there's something else over here that's happening.
It's fuzzy when you mean nitrogen
I seem to
retention.
think it's
This is
anecdotal, and it's probably just experience of living here
nitrogen
for a long
amount
time.
versus,
You seem to have more algae
I guess,
issues when
it's
the
being
water levels
back
are
and
low,
forth.
There's not much flow, and there's not much
It's a little
rain,
bit
and it's very hot.
ambiguous.
All the things
Okay,
that might
I'm still
affect
working on that.
I know,
cook the lake a little bit.
because I'm a
Whereas this
physician,
year,
so
in
I know
terms
nitrogen is
of,
important, but
in our portion of the lake where we usually see
you
more
just need to know
oscillatory,
good or bad,
and it seems to be
oversimplified,
very light in the late July period.
what a high nitrogen level
One of the
is.
things that I was wondering is, who does the town coordinate cyanobacteria with? I took down Tracy's.
There's
Yeah.
a person named,
I took down Amanda's. name
Amanda McQuaid.
because I I've talked to them about it, and they close the beach. They close the town beach when they see it. But, when I ask for measurements and, what they've done, and, it gets very fuzzy after that. So I know that, I'm not sure that if the town's taking instructions from the state, or, they're doing it on their own, I'm not really sure how that works, but it's a little bit of a concern, because at the state park beach, that is definitely, people from DES come down, I mean, that's now is required to be tested, because it's like a public swimming pool almost, so it has to be. But our beach is not, so I was just wondering if you knew anything about that, or is it abandoned before you that I would.
Should he also have Tim's number? Is that?
So the way that, so right now we've had a study going on with Pawtuckaway, yet another study going on with Pawtuckaway, to try to predict when we have bacteria problems.
Bacteria problems.
Bacteria, not cyanobacteria,
No,
but just
bacteria.
fecal bacteria problems at the state park. And we're using this as a model for how we might do this. And how
painful weekend.
geese are a major issue.
Geese are a big problem.
So, but in terms of cyano, that's a little different.
Yeah.
And cyano is basically, we don't know until somebody reports a bloom. And then what happens is we go gather a sample, or sometimes we send a sample out to Dr. Haney's lab out at UNH, and then we get counts back on the number of cells, and then we identify the number of cells. And if that cell count is above 70,000, we definitely know that there's a problem. And then we usually, DES will then go back out and we'll sample until the numbers drop below 70,000 and it looks clear and people can go ahead. Generally with cyanobacteria, what we tell people, because oftentimes we can't get out there or they can't get a sample to us, we don't know whether it's toxic species or not toxic species, it's very complex.
Or when it's toxic.
If it looks gross, don't swim in it. That's our highly technical advice. I know it sounds kind of trite.
My grandmother would have done that one.
Absolutely true. If you see weird looking, swirly blue greens and clumps of this and that in the water column, really keep your pets out of it because it's really deadly for pets. And really don't swim in it until the water clears up. And I think that's really, it's common sense advice, but you'd be amazed. And so we really want people to do that. So the towns don't play a huge role in cyanobacteria. Some towns do a lot with their bacteria, their fecal bacteria. And I don't know what Nottingham has in terms of its schedule for sampling, but if they'd like to do sampling, they want to get it to the lab and that stuff, we'll certainly take their
Yeah, I don't know how rigorous they are about any of that. I was just sort of inquiring about that. Back to the state park for a minute, bacteria state park. So, a long time ago, it was suggested that if they started an aeration process of some sort, whether they used a super bee or they used a pump or they used, because we know that aeration helps to negate bacteria. And instead, they close the beach, they lose the revenue, it creates what I would call a negative social media environment for all of us. Oh, Pawtuckaway's dead again. No, they closed the state park beach. It's got nothing to do with where Neil's living, But, the social media, if there's this much news, it suddenly becomes this big if it impacts, people's lives. And it seems to me that this problem of bacteria at the state park beach has been going on for a long time, and nobody has really offered solutions, or are there solutions, are there simple solutions? What do they cost? What would it take to experiment with that? Do you need $5,000? Neil will write you a check. But that kind of very practical,
After you vote.
I mean, the science is great, but there's a problem.
Yeah.
And they're probably losing on a weekend where they have the beach closed because of that. They're probably losing, $3,000 a weekend, if not more, because of the revenue from the store.
Yeah, I've never heard of anybody doing aeration for fecal bacteria. Generally, the issue is source control. And so the big problems have been, trying to make sure the beach is cleaned up at the end of the day so that you don't attract geese. There's been some geese deterrents that have been employed, whether they be dogs or they have some some other things that can scare away
Sounds.
the geese. And I think just those are the kinds of things that are generally been successful. And then the hope is that we'll understand a little better about, through some of the modeling and some of the research, of when do we have, is it if you get more than 200 kids in the lake at that little beach, do we start to see problems with bacteria? Is it simply, humans? Or is it, what is it, the wind conditions under certain conditions, or temperature, or
That's generous.
flow, or, these are all the kinds of issues that we want to get better at understanding. I've not ever heard of anybody doing some sort of a manipulation like that.
So another simple thing might be because the goose fecal is, it's in the sand and it sort of, stays in the sand, and then there's runoff through the sand all winter. I think that there's a compounding effect, at least my discussions with people at the park seem to indicate that it's not just that day that they pooped on the beach. It's like an accumulation, and yet there's been no attempt that I've seen to scrape the beach and start with fresh sand.
Right, my understanding is that they, for a while, I don't know if they're still doing this, is that the lifeguards were actually going out in the morning and removing whatever
Existing on the
surface. And again, I think
Hell of a good job for a lifeguard, huh?
there are some studies that show how long the bacteria takes to degrade. If it's on the surface, it actually degrades pretty quickly, within, days.
Yeah.
So, I don't know whether there's, again, I think that would be part of the science study that would need to be done, would be to look at whether or not you find bacteria levels down in the sand.
Yeah, good idea.
And that would be something that would have to be studied. There's ways of doing that. But that would be an interesting suggestion. I'll make that to the folks who are doing that Tuckaway study.
Yeah.
Well, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Wayne.
Thank you, guys.